Hi, I'm Mike Loshinsky, and I'm the Program Director for Pain and Migraine Research at the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke. Today, I'll be speaking to you about research funding options for clinical and basic science research in the area of pain and how you can fund that through the NIH. I have nothing to disclose here, and the views I'm presenting today are mine, and they're not the official views of the NIH or NINDS. Pain has a tremendous clinical burden. The Institute of Medicine report in 2011 identified that there are more than 100 million Americans that live with pain, and more than 25 million Americans that live with chronic debilitating pain. There's a huge financial burden associated with that, and it's the #1 reason why people are out of work. So the mission of finding treatments and understanding the basic science of acute pain and chronic pain is an important part of the work we do at NINDS and at other institutes at NIH that fund research and support projects studying pain. Let me give you a little bit of a background on the federal directives and where NIH's policies and roadmap for pain funding comes from. In 2010, the Affordable Care Act included language designed to advance pain research, care, and education. And it also established the Interagency Pain Research Coordinating Committee, which we call the IPRCC. So on behalf of the HHS, NIH established this Interagency Pain Research Coordinating Committee, and this agency coordinates pain research across all the federal agencies. And a part of that plan was to ask the Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academies, to really do a report of understanding pain's impact on Americans. And that was the IOMN report in 2011. All of these federal reports are free and open to the public, and if you just do an internet search associated with those names that I put up there, you can find them. Following the Institute of Medicine report, the NIH put together with outside stakeholders the National Pain Strategy for improving the health of Americans and their experience with pain. And then that led in 2017 to the Federal Pain Research Strategy. So the outgrowth of the Federal Pain Research Strategy is really the NIH's roadmap and goals for how to fill the gaps of understanding how to treat patients with pain, how to fill the gaps in scientific knowledge we have associated with understanding the pathophysiology of pain, and to understand the needs of patients associated with that. And that was broken up into these different bins that we have listed here: prevention of acute and chronic pain, acute pain and acute pain management, the transition from acute to chronic pain, and then chronic pain management. Now, an aspect of research that touches all of these different categories of pain research is the disparities in access to treatment and the disparities in the experience of pain amongst different ethnic and other groups. So we know that there's a basic science component in order to fill these gaps, and we also had identified the clinical science. And that will lead us to understanding the mechanisms, and of course the goal is to give physicians new tools to treat pains and give patients access to those new treatments so that we can relieve their suffering and pain. In 2018, in response to the opioid epidemic, NIH was charged with creating the HEAL initiative that's helping to end addiction long term. It's an aggressive trans-agency effort to speed scientific solutions to stem the nation's opioid public health crisis. And it's really broken into two portions: enhancing pain management and then improving treatments for misuse and addiction. I'm not going to be dealing with the addiction portion today. We're going to be talking about options for pain treatment. And those are broken up into two different work groups or teams, and that's the clinical research and pain management, and also the preclinical and translational pain research. Now, there's been an expansion of the opportunities for clinical research within the HEAL initiative. And we've done that in a variety of ways. One of them is to create research networks such as the EPICnet, which is the early phase investigational pain research network. And this network is a hub and spoke model, and it supports phase 2 clinical trials for biologics, small molecules, and devices to treat pain. There's also a large backpack consortium, and that's to probe the mechanisms for back pain and to develop and test integrative precision medicine approaches for treating back pain. We have the Effectiveness Research Network, this Effectiveness Pain Management Network. That's to inform patients and providers for these best practices for things that we learned from our other research networks inside of HEAL and other parts of NIH for how to best treat patients with different types of pain disorders. There's PRISM, which is the pragmatic and implementation studies for the management of pain. These pragmatic clinical trials are done in a real-life setting, so it's much easier to translate what we learn from these clinical trials into clinical practice, because that's where the clinical trials were done. There's the HOPE Network, which is the integrated approach to pain and opioid use in hemodialysis patients, an area of patients that were particularly identified with a need for finding opioids, a replacement for opioids for their treatment. Then we have a specific biomarkers program, which will aid in the development of all these clinical trials, and device translational and clinical research support. Now, this is a summary of many of the clinical research opportunities inside HEAL and across NIH for supporting clinical research into pain. The rest of the talk is going to be more focused on preclinical research, basic science research, as well as translational research, developing support for developing new therapeutics, biologics, small molecules, and we'll touch a bit more on devices. So let's talk about grants at NIH, how to apply for pain grants, how to find funding opportunities, etc. So NIH is composed of 27 different institutes and centers, of which 24 of these institutes and centers actually award grants. Most of the examples I'm going to be giving you here are specific for the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke, NINDS. So if you're interested in a pain area which isn't covered by NINDS, and we'll discuss a bit with mission relevance towards the end of the talk, then you should reach out to program staff and those other institutes so that you can get the specific guidance from those staff to make sure that your application is responding to the right funding announcement and includes the proper components. I can't underemphasize how important it is to always reach out to program staff before you apply for a grant. Even if you're receiving guidance from your colleagues, may they be a mentor or even people who have had many years of NIH funding, the policies and funding announcements change very often, and the emphasis of the study sections also change. So it's always good to reach out to program staff to make sure that you're getting the most up-to-date and accurate information. So NINDS's role in NIH's pain research is multifaceted. Number one, NIH plays a lead role in the Pain Consortium. The Pain Consortium consists of membership from nearly all the NIH institutes and centers, because pain in some way touches the mission of every one of those institutes. In the case of NCI, the National Cancer Institute, there's cancer pain and chemotherapy-induced neuropathy. NIDDK, there's diabetic neuropathy and other visceral organ pains. At NINDS, there's an emphasis on, or what's in the pain types that are in our mission are headache pain, be it cluster headache or migraine, as well as neuropathic pain, pain due to spinal cord injury, pain in lesions due to multiple sclerosis, which are central lesions, so central pain, and basic pain mechanisms, okay? So those fall into NINDS's mission. So the pain consortium gets together to make sure that across NIH that there's a concerted effort in order to address the gaps in pain science. NINDS, we also support the development of better pain models that are within our mission, developing new targets for treating pain, especially non-addictive ones, validating those targets, specific drug discovery for developing small molecules or for supporting small businesses, and biologics, and then of course the devices, as I mentioned earlier. So how do you find a good funding opportunity? So if you go to grants.gov, there's a search engine over there, and you can pop in pain, and then there's going to be dozens of them brought up. Now you can also refine your search with multiple terms, such as including neuropathic pain, let's say, or pain clinical trials, and that will give you some new program announcements. Let me give you a little bit of the behind-the-scenes secrets about what these labels and numbers mean when you see a program announcement or a funding announcement number. They will either start in a PA, PAR, PAS, or RFA. That's what's listed here on the slide. PA means it's a program announcement. There's no specific review. There's no specific money associated with it. And what it means is that NIH wanted to advertise that we're interested in applications in this area. At some institutes, this is brought into consideration when it comes to funding decisions, all right, but not at all institutes, okay? So that funding announcement, just with a PA label, doesn't mean that there's money set aside or special review. PAR, that R refers to a special review or a special receipt date that's not on the normal cycle. The PAS, that final S there, can be thought of as a dollar sign. So program announcements or PASs have money set aside, and RFAs have special receipt dates, special review, and money set aside. They are issued by ICs, and if you don't see a specific funding announcement for your area of research, that does not mean that NIH is not interested in your research. What it means is that you should apply to what we call the parent funding announcement. So there's a parent R01 for the research program grants, or an R21 or R03s, et cetera. And if you do a internet search for parent R01 or parent R21 NIH, those funding announcements will pop up in your search engine. So let's look at some of the funding announcements specifically for pain research. For basic science pain research, for model development, and even for some clinical studies, but in the case of NINDS, clinical trials will not be accepted on this funding announcement. There are other funding announcements we use for some funding clinical trials for pain. I recommend that you look at the mechanisms, models, measurement, and pain in pain research. It says clinical trial optional because NIH has a broad definition of clinical trials, and some clinical research that's really looking at mechanisms falls into this clinical trial category. And you should really look into the NIH's clinical trial guidance documents in order to get the details on that, or reach out to program staff. But this is PA, program announcement. Again, no set aside, no special review, et cetera. 18-11 is the R01 version, and then the R21 version is PA 18-159. This is what we call our 4-pain omnibus for pain research. Nearly all the institutes that accept pain grants are subscribed to this and will accept applications from this program announcement. If you're studying basic science and pain, this is a good place to start. Now, if you're developing therapeutics and you have a hit to lead, the HEAL initiative has a funding announcement, non-addictive analgesic therapy development for small molecules and biologics to treat pain. This is a phased mechanism, and the RFA is RFA NS21-021. Now you notice these numbers here, this 18 or this 21. That's the year that the funding announcement was originally published. And they're usually around for 3 years and then subject to renewal, okay? So you see this NS21 is very new because the first receipt date will be in 2021, and the first receipt date from this one here was in 2018. Now, if your project, it doesn't have, your translational project doesn't have a hit to lead that's ready for this HEAL initiative one, we have what we call the IGNITE proposals. That's innovative grants to nurture initial translational efforts. And there's 3 different program announcements. And I have later slides to give you the details of the difference between the 2. But suffice to say, if you're working on assay development or you're generating a model for screening, this is a good funding announcement to look at. The BRAIN Initiative has even put out a notice to say that they would are interested in applications to support the fundamental neurobiology of pain processing. You should take a look at that. That's NOT-NS 18-008. And then if you're interested in behavioral and integrative treatment and management of pain, there's an R01 and an R34 version with these PAR numbers. That means they have special review. Now, if you work with a small business or you're an academic that collaborates with a small business, then an SBIR or the STTR might be a good option for you. And this notice, NOT-NS 19-041, will give you guidance on directing pain applications either to small businesses, the SBIR, or collaborations, strong collaborations between academia and small business, the STTRs. And then, of course, there's always the parent R01 and R21. That's the PA 20-185 or PA 20-184, which is the R21, the parent R21 versions. And if you don't see a specific funding announcement, that does not mean that NIH is not interested in your research or that your particular project. It means that you should come in on an investigator-initiated one. And at NINDS, you have equal possibility of getting your grant funded if it comes in on a specific PA or if it comes in on the parent one. So don't fret. So let me give you some more detail about the helping to end addiction long-term, this HEAL initiative, non-addictive analgesic therapy development for small molecules and biologics. The goal of this is to develop analgesics with little or no abuse liability. So agonists for the mu-opioid receptor, even optimizing those, are excluded from here. The goal here is to find treatments for pain that are not mu-opioid based. So the projects can enter either at the discovery stage, so medicinal chemistry will be required to identify the best preclinical candidate, or the developmental stage of where you already have your clinical candidate and tox studies and other refinement of the molecule is what you need to be done. And this will support the development of that small molecule biologic through phase 1 clinical trials. So the phase 1 clinical trial support is included. We also, what's important to realize here is that the vast majority of the works that will be done here will be done through contracts that NIH has with CROs that will do the medchem, et cetera, or work for you. So usually we expect the animal model or some specific screening assay to be done by the applicant. So these budgets are typically small that go to the actual applicant, but the budget overall is very large for these projects because of the work with the contractors that we have. We also build a consultant team with expertise in medchem and formulation, and even with experience with VC, so they understand the market very well, and that can be very helpful for you. And again, it includes biologics. But let's say your project is not really ready for the hit to lead optimization, but you're in the process of developing assays, or you need to do a screen of a library, or some in vivo proof of concept work for a treatment. Again, this is not basic science mechanistic studies. These are therapeutics development. At NINDS, we have the IGNITE program. This is the Innovative Grants to Nurture and Initiate Translational Efforts. And there's 3 different program announcements that will support either assay development, screening, or these in vivo proof of concept. And the goal of this program is to prepare an application to have everything you need for the non-addictive analgesic therapeutics development HEAL Initiative Award, okay? Which will then provide those CROs and consultants. And both of these are milestone driven, and they're phased mechanisms. So we're going to monitor your progress along the way based on milestones that we negotiate after funding. They have to be in the initial application, and then we negotiate them afterwards to refine them to make sure that we're on track to be successful. So again, the three different types of projects that Ignite supports are assay development and compound screening, rigorous in vivo efficacy studies. This includes the PK/PD studies, even early ADME and tox support, and you can use your biologics or small molecules. And also the development of clinically relevant, carefully validated animal models. That's also supported within Ignite, and ex vivo models and PD markers. Okay. Another part of the HEAL initiative is the platform screening program for pain. And this is really a mechanism for profiling compounds for companies that have assets but would like to profile them in their ability to bind or not bind opioid receptors, to look at abuse liability and some initial pharmacokinetic studies, to look at efficacy in a variety of animal models, in some general animal models, and some disease-specific ones, and then to validate endpoints and develop new models also. So the HEAL initiative sponsors this preclinical screening program for pain at NINDS, and the goal here is to really entice small companies and academics to bring their molecules forward to help them in their profiling their compounds to figure out whether or not they'd be appropriate for treating pain, okay, to give them early evidence there. There's a tremendous amount of emphasis here around privacy of the data, and you know, the professionalism associated with running these models can give people a good unbiased data to help them make their decision if they want to pursue a compound for treating pain. And the website for reaching out for this program is listed here on the slide. And Smriti Iyengar is the program lead for that project. So there are lots of different clinical programs and translational programs at NINDS to support pain research. I can't summarize all of them now. I've just given you a taste of a few of them. Now this particular slide identifies NeuroNext, which is a clinical trial network, or the StrokeNet, or Siren, which is a clinical trials network for doing clinical trials in the emergency department, which could be which would accept pain proposals also. Then there's the preclinical screening program, a platform for pain, the PSPP program, which I just recently mentioned. And then the contracts that we have for ADME tox, chemistry, and manufacturing, and even doing that phase 1 clinical trial associated with the HEAL analgesic development program. So there's really a lot of choices for doing clinical trials or your preclinical and therapeutic development. So let me show you some of the clinical trial options that there are. There's the Siren program, again, for doing clinical trials in the emergency department. There's NeuroNext, which is a network of academic sites with expertise in lots of different neurological disorders. So if your pain disorder falls into that category, this would be a good choice. We also have the HEALS EPICnet, which will support phase 2 clinical trials for testing therapeutics. We have a biomarker discovery program, and we even have a common data elements program, which will support clinical trials, will support pain projects and developing clinical data elements, common data elements for them. One example of that is the common data elements that NIH contributed to developing in the area of headache, and that includes migraine and other headache disorders. These are really useful common data elements to help you get your clinical trial started in order to know what which clinical instruments to use, which questionnaires, what are the minimum data that you should capture in order to be able to compare that data across other trials, and to also make sure that the trial is rigorously designed. So reach out to the resources on this website. You can just do a a Google search on NINDS common data elements, or CDE's NINDS migraine or headache, and this page will pop up. And there's instructions for how to use them, and of course, cite them in your papers. And that, I hope, gave you an overview of the many, many different options for supporting basic science, translational, and clinical research in pain through NIH. Now, I'm going to reiterate that one of the most important things you could do before you submit that application is reach out to program staff. So I'm including my email address here, and I'm looking forward to seeing your proposals. Thank you very much.